Still in that region, several African countries, including South Africa, have made commitments to move to a net zero emissions economy. This is in response to climate science showing to halt climate change, carbon emissions must stop. Net zero means that any emissions are balanced by absorbing an equivalent amount from the atmosphere. To meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming target in the Paris Agreement, global carbon emissions should reach net zero around mid-century. For many African countries, that can mean the 2050s or the 2060s. And for developed nations, it means 2050 or preferably earlier. Now, joining me to speak on this development is Nick Hedley, a climate change writer and columnist. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Now, Nick, it's obvious that Africa has contributed very low to climate change, even though we suffer the most. Why should it care about helping to solve the problem that other countries created?
It's a very good question. It's obviously extremely unjust and unfair. Africa has contributed about 2.5% contributes about 2.5% to global emissions, and South Africa contributes the bulk of Africa's contribution. Unfortunately, though, the planet is all very much connected. So even though it's the US and China and Russia and others that have caused the crisis that we're in, unfortunately, everyone suffers from it. Unfortunately for Africa, Africa tends to suffer the most and is the least prepared to deal with the impacts.
Okay, Nick. Also, getting to net zero emissions by 2050 means that all countries need to cut emissions much faster, particularly large economies. Is this possible in Africa?
It absolutely is. The kind of fortunate thing for Africa, we've already seen it before with sort of leapfrogging landline telephones and going straight to mobile connectivity. And as a result of that, we have the world's best developed mobile money network on the planet. It's not a prerequisite to develop, to use carbon intensive sources of energy. We kind of at a fortunate inflection point where the cheapest sources of energy in the history of humankind are solar and wind. And Africa has the best resources, some of the best resources of solar and wind in the world. So it can very easily leapfrog the sort of old energy system of the past, which was coal, oil, and gas, and leapfrog that to a cleaner, far cheaper energy future.
All right, speaking of resources, Nick, it is a no-brainer that climate finance will be essential in tackling climate change issues. Now, in 2009, developed nations committed to mobilizing $100 billion a year for the developing countries. Have these developed nations kept their promises so far?
Unfortunately not. So since 2009, there's not been a single year where developed countries have come close to meeting that $100 billion a year mark. We still, the best we can do is about 80 billion in a year. There's increasing pressure on wealthy nations who have caused this crisis to step up and meet those commitments. They're still quite a way off, but there is some progress starting. The sort of unfortunate thing, so South Africa is now the first beneficiary of a major sort of unilateral climate finance deal at COP21 in November. At COP26 in November 2021, South Africa announced an $8.5 billion deal with a handful of wealthy nations. It does comprise mostly of loans. They are cheap loans, low interest loans, but the share of grants is lower than, I guess, what we'd like. It is a start, but hopefully going forwards, there'll be a higher proportion of grants in the mix relative to loans. However, funding is needed. It's a very good start. It's a move in the right direction.
All right, and Nick, what does the energy transition mean for South Africa? How would it impact communities that are already experiencing the high unemployment rates?
It's a good question. It's a political matter as everything else is, where there's the sort of northeast of South Africa. It hosts a lot of our coal mines and our coal power plants. And there's obviously, as you can understand, a lot of anxiety in those communities about what the transition means for them. One thing I think that's important to bear in mind is that the transition to a cleaner energy system is inevitable. It will happen just because the economics of fossil fuels, it's no longer in favor of fossil fuels. It's no longer the cheapest source of energy. And a lot of South Africa's very old coal power stations are reaching their end of life. So one way or another, the transition will happen. It needs to be handled with extreme care, and plans need to be put in place long before those coal mines and coal power plants are decommissioned, to have alternatives in place for those workers and communities. Now, there are a lot of opportunities for new jobs in the sort of green economy. Unfortunately, for a lot of coal workers and coal plant workers, they might not be the ones to get those jobs. So It's very important that the region diversifies its economy and comes up with new ways to absorb all of those jobs and more, and to create a fairer economy in the process.
Climate change writer and columnist Nick Hedley, thank you so much for joining us on the news.
Thanks.